Welcome to the 116th pilgrimage to St. Tikhon of Zadonsk Monastery, located in South Canaan, Pennsylvania. As you can well see, I am not at the monastery, but I am in my parish in Glen Mills, Pennsylvania, because of the stay-in-place order within our counties. But I have been asked, as curator of the Metropolitan Museum of the Orthodox Church in America and the repository, to be able to give you a glimpse, a virtual glimpse, of the treasures that we have and house at our monastery and repository. In order for me to explain the significance of these days, I must go back to the year 1905, July 31st, when the first pilgrimage to St. Tikhon's occurred. It was shortly after the land on June 26, 1905 was bought, and it was going to be both a monastery and an orphanage. It was begun at a service that was led by Saint Raphael Hawawini, who at that time was Bishop of Brooklyn, who came from New York to be able to dedicate the small existing farmhouse as a future orphanage as well as monastery. The idea of the dedication of Decoration Day or Memorial Day came the following year, in May 30th, 1906, when Archbishop Tikhon of New York came as the main celebrant for the blessing of the place where the new monastery would be erected. A newspaper from the local area stated the following: an indication of the importance of this event was the religious procession consisting of Russian societies of the two valleys, which was over 1 mile long. The services lasted all day. Members of the church and over 2,000 others present came there fasting, and this they observed until the services ended. Confessions were heard prior to the dedication liturgy, and there were hundreds of communicants at this special dedication liturgy. The ceremonies of the dedication were conducted by Archbishop Tikhon of New York, who was also celebrant at the liturgy. My dear brothers and sisters, shortly thereafter, 2 new novices arrived on the grounds. But because of the limitations of the existing farmhouse, they had to reside in a small house that was located just a short distance from the orphanage, which already was receiving young children under the care of an Arab nun named Maria. It's important to understand that the orphanage, the monastery, and eventually later the seminary were all interconnected in South Canaan. The orphanage actually originally was dedicated to the memory of Saint Pantaleimon. That's why if you have ever visited the monastery, you'll see an icon, a very large one, from Mount Athos that was presented upon the opening of this orphanage. But I have been asked to explain to you today, as I do this virtually, of some of the high points during the course of the monastery's history, especially during times of trouble. For example, in 1916 and 1915, of course, the United States was involved in a world war. The monastic community had worked and strived to be able to aid their brothers and sisters back in the old country during this devastating time. And they erected a church known as the Church of the Dormition, which was dedicated to those who gave their lives in the initial part of World War I. Following that, they felt that it was needed to have a poorhouse located on the monastery grounds. So they went around collecting funds, but of course, because of the war and the lack of communication with Imperial Russia, funds began to wane. And it was very difficult for them to accomplish this task. However, homeless people from various hamlets and cities where they were indigent came to the monastery in anticipation of the establishment of this poorhouse. But of course, that never came to be. However, the monks took these people in and housed them in whatever conditions they could so that they would not be without a place over their heads. And in 1916, there was an entire small community of these people living on the grounds. Also, the monastery was in charge of caring for the orphans at that time, and the church took the orphans originally after and brought them to Brooklyn, where they established a special orphanage. From there, they transported them to Springfield, Vermont, but by that time there were over 125 orphans. And there was a great need because of the pandemic and the diphtheria epidemic of 1917 and 1918 to again reestablish an orphanage on the monastery grounds. And they did, with over 100 children coming back to St. Tikhon's Monastery, where they were educated and taught by the monastic brotherhood, not only in language, but church singing and various other normal tasks in a school atmosphere. This lasted through the entire early 20s, but of course we know that in Russia there was a revolution and a civil war. Funds dried up, and the monastery no longer had the means by which to work without having to do other labors. So they raised cattle, they had farming, and those that lived on the grounds helped the monks in these tasks, as well as the children. There was an important occasion in 1923 when the pilgrimage was held at the monastery. There was a children's choir established just from the orphans who sang all the responses for the liturgy on Memorial Day weekend. It was a great feat in itself, and they were taught by a monastic named Lazar, who taught them in Slavonic how to offer prayers unto the Lord. Many of these orphans at the monastery eventually went on to be choir directors. So for many years after the closing of the Tenafly Seminary in New Jersey in 1923, St. Tikhon's became actually the only functioning so-called school to train future priests and choir directors. And this, of course, lasted until the foundation of both St. Vladimir's Seminary in New York and St. Tikhon's Pastoral School on the monastery grounds. What's interesting is throughout the Depression and times thereafter, the monastery not only welcomed pilgrims, but took care of pilgrims. It was a known fact that when people came to the monastery, that they were taken care of by the monastic community and sharing with the people of Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, Ohio, and the various other states. This was an important feat. And in 1944, the annual pilgrimage was observed by thousands of individuals who had come even in the midst of the war, the Second World War. And I would like to read an excerpt from an eyewitness at that time. There were very few male pilgrims, as the war was still on. Many of those males who were present were in uniform, There were few cars, as an A sticker didn't give quite enough gas to travel any distance. There were quite a few buses, and in those days it was taboo to ride under the arch, so the cars and the buses were parked in the fields where the present seminary building complex now stands. The seminary building in those days consisted of an old converted two-story farmhouse and a small budka, or a little place behind it. After the church services were over, people dispersed to their buses and cars for their boxed lunch that they brought. However, the monks, in order to take care of them, would bake 5-pound loaves of bread and huge tubs of borscht to share with the pilgrims. And as many of the pilgrims stated, and I quote, "It was heavenly bread, and passed it out to the pilgrims as long as it lasted." Those who got a piece of monastery bread cherished it and affirmed that the borscht could never be as good anywhere else within the world. Pilgrims, by and large, had to bring their own food, and many acquaintances were made, sharing food with those in the next auto, or on a bus, or in the fields. This was worthy of mention because many foods were rationed and in very short supply during the Second World War. The monks, we know from an eyewitness account, were very much in evidence at the pilgrimage. They were mostly of European origin, and the pilgrims sought out those particularly from the sections of the old country that they came from. What a wealth of devotion, knowledge, and life-giving experiences they did bring at that time to the American soil. Following several years of working in the fields and raising cattle, St. Tikhon's eventually established a pastoral school in order to educate American-born boys in theology and to prepare them for the priesthood. The monastics of St. Tikhon's Monastery played a very important part in their education. One particularly was Bishop Jonah Stallberg. He eventually became the Bishop of Washington, D.C. years ago. And he wrote, and I quote, "Of great concern will be the preservation and expansion of orthodoxy in this country for the citizens of the United States of America, and for all those residing here, whether of Russian origin or from other national backgrounds. Firmly bound by our ties to this country, we must move forward and progress here in a steadfast dedication to the historic purpose of our church." You see, my dear brothers and sisters, St. Tikhon's from its inception involved all ethnic groups: Arab, Greek, Serbian, Russian, Carpatho-Russian, and the like. It's important for us to know that they all worked together for the establishment of the first Orthodox monastery in America, accepting people from all over the world, especially those who were fleeing from the war in Europe. One of those dedicated individuals was Father Andronik, who eventually became the head of the monastery and eventually the dean of St. Tikhon. He was a missionary following the revolution and the civil war in India, and that has always been an interesting point, is that with him came the friendship with the church, the Oriental Church in India. As Father Andronik would say later, he was a man extremely interested in developing an American form of monasticism. He stated, and I quote, "Today monasteries are necessary everywhere. The tempests of life, like the angry waves of the ocean, are striking our holy church, throughout the world, which is like a boat on that ocean. Therefore, besides having our parish churches, we must also have stronger places, so-called pillars, those places which will humbly and bravely take the full force of all the storms, but will stay firm and strong as ever. Those places are our monasteries. He also wrote, though we cannot glory in the number of members in our community or its economical organization, we may well note the regularity of its liturgical life. Daily the monks serve vespers, matins, divine liturgy in the hours, piously, devotedly, and completely. This completes the Christian life. It shines like a modest little vigil lamp across the vastness of America. So you see, my brothers and sisters, it's important for us to realize that St. Tikhon's was that candle and is that candle in the American church, especially not only for those who were born into Orthodox families, but for those over the last 100 and some years who have been received into the Orthodox Church, because truly this is all of our homes. This is our home. This is the center of orthodoxy for the Orthodox Church in America. It was here also that in 1970, October 20th, in a very remote setting, as it states in the Pocono Mountains, a procession of 319 priests and laymen, followed by 10 bishops and archbishops, and his Beatitude, the Most Blessed Irénée, Metropolitan of the Church, made its way to the monastery church of St. Tikhon, where this august body gathered inside the church to hear the proclamation of the Thomas of Autocephaly of the Orthodox Church in America. No one can put into words the great joy that rang out through the participants in this gathering. Songs of praise and of thanksgiving were heard entreating God's blessings upon the new church, upon the new Autocephalous church in America that was brought about by the work of several of our bishops, priests, and laymen. St. Tikhon's has always been involved with the bishops, the priests, and the laymen. It was the parishes in Pennsylvania, especially in the valleys, that helped the monastery in many of its tasks over the last 115 years. And they should be thanked for all the work that they have done. Many of our ancestors were part of St. Tikhon's over the last 115 years, and it is indeed an honor that I have been asked to welcome you to this prize of our church, the Metropolitan Museum of the Orthodox Church in America. Actually, this year marks the 25th anniversary of its founding, first as a repository located in the bell tower behind the monastery church, and then later to the new edifice that we have built over the bookstore as you enter the monastery grounds. In this museum, you will see many of the treasures of the history of our church in America. It is not a museum in that sense, it's rather a repository, a place where we can venerate the icons, venerate the relics of the saints that we possess, and the items that belong to many of the saints who walked on these holy grounds. We cannot forget the memory of Saint Patriarch Tikhon. We cannot forget the memory of Father Alexis, Saint of the Church Toft. We cannot forget the memory of Saint Nikolai Velimirovich, who lived and died on these grounds, as well as Father Alexander Hatavitsky, Father Kachurov, and many, many other saints of the Orthodox Church in America. It was through the intercessions of our first American saint, Herman of Alaska, whose church I am residing in now, that has brought many blessings. This on the 50th anniversary of his canonization in Kodiak, Alaska, August of 1970. It was always stated that in order to be truly an autocephalous church, we had to have saints that were indigenous to our people, to our country. And Saint Herman, the Appa of the Native American people of Alaska, was and is such a saint for us. So as we celebrate the 50th anniversary of the canonization of Saint Herman of Alaska, the 50th anniversary of the Thomas of Autocephaly, as well as the 55th anniversary of the falling asleep of one of the greatest hierarchs of our church in America, Metropolitan Leonti of thrice blessed memory, I invite you virtually this afternoon to watch various tours of the monastery that I have supplied and was able to publish this afternoon, so that you can see the work and the items, the ecclesiastical items that we house here. I appreciate the time and the effort, and know that even though you're not physically present here, nor am I must say that we are together as one church in our hearts and in our minds. We are here, first of all, to continue the tradition of a pilgrimage. And we don't necessarily have to be present on the monastery grounds, because we are present in our hearts with His Beatitude, Metropolitan Tikhon, Archimandrite Sergius, the monastic brotherhood, and all the faithful throughout the American continent on this, the 116th pilgrimage to our beloved first monastery in America.